Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to touch on some mechanics that I have talked about in passing before, but I figured that it might be good to get down into the nitty-gritty of how they work, and more importantly, the ways in which they might give storytellers or players misgivings or misunderstandings, so that we can all really just be on the same page and help keep our games going forward. To start with, I would like to talk about the mechanics of integrity, willpower, and virtue and vice, found on page 73 of the core rulebook. But to start this discussion, we need to understand what willpower is and why it matters. Now, your willpower is made up of a combination of your character's resolve and their composure, which makes sense when you sit down and ask what those things are supposed to represent. Because your composure is how unflappable are you? How do you just take things in stride when weird things happen or when you may be in danger? And your resolve is, well, your emotional stability, your ability to push through, to continue moving on to your goals no matter what gets in your way. And when you put those two things together, what you have is a pool of potential of what is your character's will like. How do they push? How do they continue on toward their goals? How do they deal when things that they don't expect or that might be dangerous or they just don't understand try to overwhelm them? And these could be mortal or mundane. That's what's important to remember about your willpower. Because whether you're involved in a road rage accident or you get attacked by a werewolf, that stat is going to be important to determine how you deal with that. But your willpower also gives you a sort of phantom pool of resources that you can use to help your character really push through things. Now, determining how much willpower you have determines how many points you have in this pool. And it goes from 2 is the smallest willpower someone can have, to 10, which is an absolutely indomitable iron will. And however many points you have, you can spend those resources to add bonuses to certain rolls, to be more resilient against certain supernatural attacks. And these things sort of represent how difficult you are to control and how well you push through adversity. So that's an important thing to just keep in mind when looking at your character and the sorts of things they're going to have to deal with. However, your willpower needs to be refreshed when you're spending those points. And you can refresh twice per game session using your virtue and your vice. Now, in the past, your virtue and vice were very deterministic. You got a list, you were supposed to pick one off of each. In this version, you and your storyteller are expected to work out a virtue and vice that is unique to your character and that really offers them more flavor, essentially, of what is unique to them. Tailor something that really fits their experience. Your virtue, as the word implies, is meant to be that thing that, well, this is a good aspect of your character. This is something that is, when are they selfless? When are they helpful? When are they willing to put others before themselves in a certain way? Or what causes do they believe in? Where your vice is something where it's, this is what you indulge in. Whether it's drug use, whether it's being lazy, whether it's, going out and starting fights with people. What is the thing they do when they've had a really hard day and they just need to unwind and take the pressure off in some way? Now, in any scene where you indulge in your virtue or vice, you get at least 1 willpower back. However, if you indulge in your virtue and you do so at great personal cost to you, or at least the potential of great personal cost, that can give you back all of your willpower because you just held on to the part of you that is best, the thing that you are willing to stake your morals, your very beliefs on in the face of adversity. And that is very important. So say, for example, you deeply believed in justice. That was your virtue, as to just pick an easy one. And it is made very clear to you that this person that you were let's say you were going after someone who is a horrendous criminal. You know they've committed these crimes, you've seen them do things, and you wanted to bring them in, give them their day in court. You wanted them off the streets to answer for the things they've done. And now, you're given a choice. You can either continue pursuing this, or you can let them go. And if you let them go, then the people who are making you this offer won't ruin your career. They won't assault you, your family, your loved ones. They won't burn down your house, whatever other like mafioso tactic you're being threatened with. Is your willingness to pursue justice enough for you to endure those threats or those actions? That's the sort of scene where you might get all of your willpower back because, well, this is a thing you believed in enough to stake yourself and your life on. Just as a frame of reference. However, that's how willpower, virtue, and vice work. This is where we get to your integrity. Now, in previous editions of the game, or at least a previous edition of the game, this was your morality score, which had certain connotations that went with it. Integrity seems very similar. On the other hand, it also strips out a lot of that black and white, good and bad thinking that usually comes with calling it morality. And this is something that, over time, I have really grown attached to. I think this was a good move. Because integrity can refer to, like, well, is it your morality? But is it also how well are you holding together? If you think of your character's psyche the way you would a war machine who has taken damage in combat, what's the integrity? Yeah, how much longer until the hull of your mind breaches and the horrors of that dark ocean start flooding into you? Because it is not necessarily meant to measure what your character's moral compass is. It is a measurement, though, of how well you are holding together. How well is your character able to look at the world and understand facts from fiction? How well are they able to see something and not have a knee-jerk reaction? How well can they handle stressors without crumbling or spiraling? Which I think is a really good way of stepping away from that XYZ input-output horror and fear mechanics and making things a lot more free form, while also taking out that question of, is this good or is this bad, while asking, is this psychologically distressing for this character? Is this going to be a problem for them specifically? Because this is another thing that the integrity score does in this game that did not happen in previous editions, that I was very suspicious of when I first saw it, and the longer I have read it, the more I will acknowledge I may have jumped the gun and overreacted on this. Because you are expected, when it comes to your character's integrity, to work with the storyteller to craft a history, to craft a psychological profile of this character so that you can both acknowledge when certain incidents will psychologically stress them and when they won't. And this is one of those things that players acting in bad faith may try to just skip out of doing the equivalent of sanity checks because their character has seen so much, they've done so much, this shouldn't bother them, I shouldn't have to make a check for this. And that's not the attitude you should bring to this. On the other hand, if you have a group that is composed of a college chemistry major, let's say, who somehow got involved in the supernatural investigation, and they're working alongside a grizzled homicide detective. Yeah, the college student who has only ever seen dead bodies in pictures suddenly walking into the lair of a serial killer is probably going to have what's called an integrity break. The grizzled homicide detective, on the other hand, may just turn down his mouth, light up a cigarette, and move on with his day because he's been following this killer for years. This is the fourth time he's come into one of these lairs, and he knows what to expect. And that is the sort of thing that I think is really useful when it comes to integrity as a mechanic, because it allows you to really customize what your characters should have experienced and what they understand, and what does and doesn't, well, follow them home and haunt their dreams at night. On the other hand, it is also important to ask, if you have those characters who are less bothered by mundane atrocities, ask what things will bother them. Because this is one of those things that is not mentioned in the fine print, but I think is very important to discuss. Go back to the homicide investigator. What are the things that bring back memories he doesn't want to have? You know, is there a certain coffee brand that having that smell reminds him of that one time that he busted probably the worst case he's ever seen? Is there a certain brand of cigarette that always gives him a cold sweat when he sees it because he's wondering, is the one that got away still out there? Are they following me? Do they get jumpy when they see certain makes of cars or when they hear certain names being shouted out? Not necessarily that simple, but it is important to ask what things will give them integrity breaks. Because again, it's not a black and white situation of yes or no, it's a question of what does this character carry with them? What is the specific combination to their lock that will open that moment where they have to take hold of themselves and realize that they either are in danger and act, or they're not in danger, but their brain and body are reacting to memories that they cannot get rid of. So that is the recommendation I would give for making sure that integrity doesn't just become players trying to craft the grittiest possible backstory to get them out of having to suffer negative consequences when they encounter the supernatural or the horrors that can lurk in our chronicles. However, there is one more mechanic that I feel is worth mentioning, and unless my fine tool is lying to me, this one does not appear in the base rulebook. It does, however, show up in a lot of the other supernatural rulebooks. So the one I'm going to be referencing is the description in Hunter the Vigil, page 76, where they talk about touchstones. And the description varies a little bit from book to book, but this is the one that I'm going to be using, so if it seems like I'm just talking about one book, it's because I'm referencing Hunter. But a touchstone is basically something that people who are living a double life use to keep their sanity intact. It is something that is attached to your integrity that is important to both add flavor to your character, but it also acts as a way to stop them from becoming what is colloquially known as a murder hobo, which is a character who has no purpose aside from seeking stress, combat, and violence. Touchstones act as things that anchor you to reality, to your life. Things that stop you from spiraling into despair, from losing yourself entirely. And that's a mechanic that didn't exist in previous versions that I think is very important and that is worth keeping in mind, even if it's something that lots of players may want to push against, because the idea of playing a character who isn't attached to anyone or anything, and they want to build those things up, is worth considering. However, typically, you get 2 touchstones at character creation, and these are attached to your integrity scores at integrity 6 and I believe integrity 4. And what these represent is they are really best thought of as anchors. That is not the mechanical term for them. Anchors refers to something else, but just run with me, I'm doing a metaphor. And a touchstone is a person, a concept, a place, an idea, something that really tethers you to your life, to your world. And often these are people. People are the easiest examples. So let's take a moment and say you're playing a hunter. They've recently taken up the vigil. They are hunting monsters. They're doing their best to protect their community. Ask who they're doing it for. Do they have children that they want to keep safe? Do they have a spouse that they need to make sure is not attacked? Do they have a parent who, they want to be the best person they can be so that that parent is proud of them? Do they have just coworkers that they're very tight with, and these people keep them, anchored? They keep them on the ground. They keep them from getting too involved in the hunt. These are all good examples of touchstones. There can also be things like, do they have a pet? Do they have anyone, anything that helps them maintain their humanity, their human connection, their community? And while touchstones are individual people, more often than not, it is also important to ask what those people can represent. Because too often, and this is something I have mentioned before very early on in this series, too often we get so invested in the supernatural half of the story that's going on, regardless of what game we're playing, that we forget or just kind of leave out that these characters are supposed to also exist in the mortal world. That's part of the struggle of playing these Chronicles, is they need to continue to live in a world that is only half-truths, that is sleepwalking. They need to acknowledge that, yes, there are supernatural concerns, but the real world is very much the playground that they have to move in, and they're essentially acting. They can't let anyone around them know what they are or what they're doing unless those people also understand what's going on behind the curtain. And I think as a mechanic, this really, I won't say forces, but it reminds players that they can't just completely indulge in the supernatural half of stuff. They can't just do the fantastical aspects, whether they want to focus entirely on learning new disciplines as a vampire, whether they're deep in the alternate worlds and whatnot that you can access as a mage, whether they are fully embracing the Fey half of Changeling. They need to pay attention to the real world. They need to ask themselves, how are they moving through it? How are they existing in the mortal world? Who matters to them and who do they matter to? What relationships do they have with people who aren't like them? And are those relationships things they've had to forge after they've become a part of the supernatural community? Or are those relationships things they had before and now they're just trying to hold on to that aspect of their former life? And all of that is worth thinking about, especially because the fewer touchstones you currently have attached to your character, which is to say whether you've lost so much integrity that they no longer are active in your life, or something has happened to them, the easier it is for your character to move without a rudder and to just spiral down until they also become a monster. And that's often not an aspect of the game that folks really want to focus on. It's not something that people think about, but in my opinion, it is one of the central cores of what should be in most Chronicles of Darkness games, because walking that edge should be a big part of things. It should be a consideration you have as a player, as a storyteller, and it should be an aspect of the stories you're telling, because it's what gives a lot of these things weight. And if you're just running around having a fun romp, doing shootouts in back alleys, you can do that in dozens of other modern fantasy games. But having to carry that weight really makes these games special, and it's what adds a lot of punch to the plot lines that we go through. And it's why I recommend really digging through these mechanics and really thinking about how they apply to your character and to your chronicle. Because if you leave them as afterthoughts, it's a big part of the engine that you're just not turning on, but it's also a big part of character development that can get left on the cutting room floor, and that, well, it will make your chronicle worse off for doing that, in my opinion. But that's all for this week. Apologies for running a little long, but I wanted to get detailed on this one because it is something that often gets overlooked. That being said, are there other mechanics you want me to talk about? Is there a particular edition that you prefer over another? And is there a particular game you'd like to see me talk about on this channel more? As always, leave all those things in the comments down below. My publisher will read them. He'll draw my attention to the ones we need to make more videos about, and hopefully we can get everybody what it is they want. And as always, make sure you like, share, subscribe, do all those things so that we can keep the show going and keep doing more episodes going forward. And until next time, have a good holiday and happy gaming, everyone.
Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Ezekiel Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.